Hey gang, Tiger Bill here, and this time we're talking about warming up. The importance of warming up before playing a gig or doing anything strenuous on the drum set. To avoid injury, it's always best to warm up. The most famous drummers in the world always warm up before a gig. Even Buddy Rich used to carry a practice pad around with him and warm up before his gigs. Now, the technique that you're going to see me using here is a technique that I developed over the years, and it consists of various techniques of other drummers, such as George Lawrence Stone, the author of Stick Control, Billy Gladstone, Joe Morello, and others. And I put these techniques together to fit a system that I refer to as tension-free drumming. Now, if you're familiar with this system, you should absolutely use it for your warm-ups, but if you're not familiar with it, just use the technique that you're used to using. You could always contact me to learn more about tension-free drumming. So you'll see during these exercises that I use arms, I use wrists, and I use fingers. And it's important to warm up in that order. The arms first, because it's the largest muscle groups, and then the wrists next, and then the fingers. And that's the way these exercises were developed. Now, when you warm up, it's extremely important to play these exercises slowly. That's the whole deal. You can start slowly, play them a few times at a slower tempo, and then gradually increase speed. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start at a slow tempo. A slow tempo for me, you may have to play it slower to warm up properly, but because I'm used to doing these drills a lot, my warm-up tempo is 80 beats per minute on the metronome. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate these as. Now, there are 4 groups of exercises, 8 measures each, and you can play them repeatedly, group 1, repeat that over, group 2, group 3, group 4 separately. But what I'm going to do now for the purposes of the video, I'm just going to play them straight through all the way down. Arm. Wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist. Arm. Arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist. arm, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist. Arm, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist, arm, wrist. Now, if my technique looks a little strange to you, especially when I'm playing faster and I'm rotating my wrists, that's because it's a technique that I developed a while back, and I call it rotational perpetual motion, or RPM for short. It's a way that I keep constant movement, and I can use my finger and my wrist together at the same time, not only to get a better sound, but I could also add my arm accents in there without affecting anything that's happening in my wrist or fingers. And I never get tense that way. Instead of playing to the point of tension and then having to do something to break it, I do this rotational perpetual motion, and I never get tense in the first place. It's pretty cool. Hey gang, that's it for now. I think you got plenty of stuff to practice to get it up to speed. And until next time, when we take our warm-ups to the next level, have fun and stay loose.